Indigenous societies of America were able to adapt to any type of land. These societies were divided into three groups: non-sedentary indigenous that, according to Shastin, led a mobile existence as hunters and gatherers; the Chichimecas of the northern Mexican deserts, as well as the Pampas in Argentina, were non-sedentary societies. Another group of indigenous were the semi-sedentary. They were characterized by living in the forests, where they depended on agriculture and hunting. The Tupis from the Amazon basin in Brazil were semi-sedentary. They also organized into gender roles instead of social class. Finally, there were the fully sedentary, who settled at high plateaus and developed into great empires. Some sedentary societies were the Mayans in southern Mexico, the Aztecs in central Mexico, and the Incas in the Andes. There, these societies developed important inventions, for example, chinampas that were floating islands, terraced slopes to grow food at the mountains, and complex social structures. According to Shastin, the way that some indigenous lived affected the encounter between Europeans and the creation of modern Latin American diversity. Those Indians that had a sedentary lifestyle were able to mix with Europeans.
Okay, so I needed to answer the question about how did Africans come to play an important part in the colonization of America. We can, like from the text, we can see that the Africans were like going to the Americas because they were going to be a big help for the colonization and the conquerors because like they were like helping like to look for their kids and for like be the ones that are in home and like work for the Spaniards. So they had the role of like slaves also. They were slaves also in Americas, and that was like their only role until the conquerors could like dominate the indigenous people, and like that was like their principal role. And that is why like in the Latin America we have like the African race, because there were so many like African people that throughout the years like they started to reproduce and like all like some place, and they like started to place in some parts of Latin America, and that's like why they also had like an important role, because they like started to populate Latin America, but their principal role was like to be the slaves of the Spaniards until they could dominate the indigenous people. A textual evidence of about what I talked is like in a page that I found that it's called the African American Registry. They say that today their descendants form significant ethnic minorities in several Latin American countries, and they are the dominant element in many of the Caribbean nations. Over the centuries, black people have been added their original contributions to the cultural mix of their respective societies, and thus exerted a deep influence on all facets of life in Latin America. A strong African influence saturates music, dance, the arts, literature, speech forms, and religious practices in Latin America and the Caribbean. Africans, whether as slaves or free immigrants, brought a variety of African cultural influences to the New World. They came from so many places in Africa and were too scattered through the Americans to establish all the conditions of their homelands. So this text gives like an example of what like some more things that the Africans brought to Latin America when they were like obligated to come to work for the conquistadors or Spaniards.
the Spaniards and the Portuguese for being born in the Iberian Peninsula and for sharing history and experiences, created models of domination that they applied in their governments. Based on what Chastain said on Encounters, the reign of Alonso the Wise, a noted lawgiver, represents a high point in this tense, multicultural Iberian world. In the end, however, the peninsula's 800 years of multicultural experience dissolved in an intolerant drive for religious purity. It is important to keep in mind that religious mysticism surrounded the Spaniards and Portuguese monarchs. Monarchies used this fervor to justify their absolute power.